preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. I'm Ed Skloot. Thank you for being patient. I'm the Education Director at the 92nd Street Y. Most of us have, at some time or another, encountered the work of Isamu Noguchi. From the sculpture gardens of the UNESCO Gardens in Paris to the Billy Rose Gardens of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. From the sets of Martha Graham's ballets to the delicate presence of Akari lanterns. From the sweeping outdoor plaza and fountains of the Renaissance Center in Detroit to that astonishing red cube just off Wall Street. Isamu Noguchi, a sculptor of space and a creator of form, is our guest this evening. One of the things that is so rewarding about him is not just this Catholic, fertile talent, but also the awareness that this talent is bold, complex, and penetrating. You don't only see his work, you virtually know it when you are close to it, in a small room, in a commodious garden, in a spacious plaza, always an authoritative, formative presence. Indeed, for many, Noguchi is the supreme shaper of the environment. Never dominating it, he serves it, masters it, and perhaps in an Eastern sense, becomes it. This year, Noguchi is 75, and he is more active than ever. He commutes regularly across continents from a home base about 3 miles from this auditorium in Long Island City in Queens. And if he is busier than ever, New Yorkers are themselves busy as well, celebrating a range of remarkable accomplishment that spans more than 50 years. A few weeks ago, for example, the city of New York placed at the entrance of Central Park on 5th and 59th a wonderful large sculpture called Unidentified Object. Last week, the Whitney Museum opened to the public a retrospective exhibition of his work. And last Saturday, the Emmerich and Pace Galleries jointly opened an exhibition of his recent work in stone. Tonight, we are pleased and flattered to present Isamu Noguchi in conversation with one of America's most imaginative and accomplished architects, Hugh Hardy. Thank you.
Turn these lights out, I'd say.
It's a very formal situation. It seemed as though it might be enjoyable to have a larger conversation than just two people. Of course, now we're totally isolated because of the remarkable work that Isamu represents. In my own case, my curiosity about all of this has to do with about roughly 3 different things. One is the idea of collaboration and the scope and the scale of the kinds of things that Isamu has worked on, and how could that be over such a long period of time? Collaborations of all sorts outside the established notion of what art and artists do. A second thing is the exploration in all forms. I mean, all kinds of turnings over of rocks. And the third thing is about what is now on view at the Whitney, a definition of, a redefinition, if you will, a constant exploration of something called space. Isamu, there are some slides.
Yes,
Wouldn't it be
I brought
helpful?
some slides upon your suggestion. Just
Mr. Bones.
to make it easy for us, you know, by maybe starting things off
Why
as a
don't you
point of argument, you know.
All right, let's do that first.
So let's show something. Here's this other mic. So if the gentleman with the machine will let the... it is a big screen. The light's much better this way. I think we should be kept this way myself. We can see you see, instead of you're seeing us. But this is the first thing I did of this sort that has to do with spaces in 1933 called Monument to the Plow, having to do with a story I had heard that Jefferson and Franklin had more or less invented the American plow, which permitted the Great Plains to be plowed and America to be opened up to development. Anyway, I want to show you a few slides like these, just to show you how I went in. I don't think it's very necessary that I should describe what they all are, but please change the slide. That's a blank, you see, that's where I went next. This was a contoured playground that I did in 1940. Go on, please. And then I did stage sets. This is not the first one, but one I did in about 46, I think, called Errand into the Maze, about the Minotaur with music of Menotti for Martha Graham. Anyway, please change. This is one called Night Journey, also for Martha. You can see them performing, meaning that you see sculpture and performance together, and that is what is interesting to me, is how the sculpture, the space, the dancers all work together. Please change. This is a playground I did for the United Nations in '52. It was not built. I had started doing them in 1933 with a thing called Play Mountain, and had occasionally since then been induced, like with the contoured playground, and then I was asked to do this, which did not get built. Please change. But I did, in 1961, I was asked to continue doing some more playgrounds, and much to my objections, I was more or less forced to do it, and in trying to defend myself, I said, well, I'd have to have an architect. I couldn't work it all myself because it never gets built. So I was fortunate enough in getting Louis Kahn to collaborate with me. And this collaboration, which is, I think, quite unique in the annals of sculptors and architects, went on for almost 5 years. This was the first model we did. Please change. This is a part of the same model. Go on, change, please. This is again blank because there's something wrong with these slides. This is another version. We did 5 different studies of what we might do on Riverside Drive at 103rd Street. And the final one, I don't know whether we have it here. Will you change, please? This is not the final one. We're near to the final. As I say, we did 5 different versions of what might be done, and had no luck whatsoever at the final session, because by then Wagner had signed all the papers so that it should be built, but he was no longer mayor, and that is, within a week he was out, and Lindsay had made other promises. Change, please. Well, anyway, this goes on to another area where, when a person thinks of plans of that sort, he really thinks of seeing it actually built. He just doesn't do it just as an exercise in ideas, but he really wants to see it built. And in this thing here was the first playground which I almost got done but didn't. The reason I didn't get it done was because the money available was all spent on you see the architecture there. I don't know would you change it, please? Maybe there's another view of it. You can see the buildings over there, which was my design actually, but unfortunately we had an architect involved who got a hold of the money, and he helped to build them all right, but spent all the money. With the result, there was nothing left for anything else. Change, please. You can see underneath this structure, which I designed and then he had executed, and all there was of this garden that was there was what you see here underneath. We were not able to continue out because of lack of funds. But what we had was sort of interesting. This is in Japan, by the way, and it's called Kodomo no Kuni, meaning children's land. It was a beginning, And I rather liked the architecture myself, which was not an architecture, but a kind of a corten steel roof with no walls, excepting for one small area which did have glass around it. Change, please. And then going on from playgrounds, this is the only playground that I was able to do was in Atlanta, Georgia, where there was a situation like this. And here I was able to build this a playground. And maybe I should show you the other photograph. Let's see the other photograph just to show the development of what happened. From a model like this, change please, it went on to building the thing, change please, into actualization like this. Well, I think that not just to merely show you, slides, change please, let's see if there's anything else. Well, here you can see what the color is a little better. Many trees and so forth. This I did without an architect. Now, if you don't mind putting this screen up so we can talk with Hugh, because I'm here to talk with Hugh, because Hugh wants to talk to me, and I would like to have a little argument with him about collaboration. Because, as you see, this thing, when you get it done on your own, like with this, without an architect, it is something which is, in some sense, architectural, you might say, but not really architecture. Change, please, since they haven't put this. Well, some more photographs of the same thing. But change, please. I don't know why I have so many photographs here, but change, please. Change, please. Change, please. Change, please. Change, please. Interminable photographs, my God. Change, please. Change. Now we're back to sculpture. But I think we don't need to talk about sculpture so much as sculpture, spaces, architecture, and all that, which I think is a more interesting subject, because sculpture in itself is really beyond the description of words, having to do with your own meditation, and you can't very well talk about it. I mean, whatever you talk about it is maybe irrelevant and not quite to the point. And nevertheless, this thing here, by the way, is called My Arizona, having to do with a thing I had made when I became interested in lights, artificial light, that is to say, having just come back from a Japanese camp in 1942. During the war, we were all locked up for a spell, and I call this My Arizona, a reflection upon the hot light of the day in Arizona, where we were, and the geometry, or whatever you want to call it, of the earth. Couldn't we just continue our conversation, Hugh, instead of looking at pictures? Please raise up the screen, and let's talk to each other.
The nature of these things is highly artificial, because eventually, if we're successful, we could include each other. What we share is a certain curiosity about exploration. The thing that, as Isamu was carrying on, it's as though you really didn't need architects at all. And it makes me think about architecture itself, which is in a state of revision. There are several conflicting theories. It's gone through the business of architecture as object, and it now seems to be deep into the business of architecture as theater. Isamu, you've been involved with the theater. You've been involved as an artist with a big A. You've sullied your hands commercially. You actually have made things that sold on a mass production basis. You have made sculpture with, not by hand, but with machines. You have had other people realize your work. You've been about as irreverent to the mother profession as anybody could be. Does that mean that you have a lack of confidence in sculpture itself? Why don't you just get on with it and be a normal sculptor?
Well, you see, the times...
we know what sculptors are supposed to do.
Well, no. Sculpture has had an extraordinary revolution, like all the other techniques we have today because of the time factor and the requirements of our age in the matter of speed, space, size, use. They're all changing, you see, so that we can't just go along exactly as we did. Although I might say that I claim to be a very old-fashioned sculptor. I'm not a very, radical sculptor, I don't think. I mean, I just don't use materials simply because they're new. In fact, I much prefer to use the old and tried.
Yes.
You see, because first of all, I think they'll last better, and there's no particular virtue in using something experimental, you might say, which you know very well isn't as good as the thing you started out with, which is ultimately, from my point of view, that which nature provides, and you don't have to really, use manufactured goods because the manufactured goods have limitations much more so than the natural nature itself, which supplies the thing. Only thing is, I am quite ready to use any tool that is invented, any improvement of tools to work with whatever mediums I want to work with, and I think we've had quite extraordinary jumps in the capacity to.
Well, there's the scale of what you could conceive.
Yeah. Do you mind if I take this? Yeah, I see.
We're all going to. Yes. But you had a whole period with working in metal and
well,
of
not
all
very
sorts.
much, not so much. Well, I don't mind working in anything, but I have worked with stone, I must say, rather consistently all the way through. I mean, from the very beginning. Beginning meaning about 22 years old, let's say, and returning to it all the time. And I must say that about my own work that I am not a very consistent person. I keep changing. I go over and run, but I do come back, so that you might say I keep rolling along, shifting, and coming back always to more or less where I started from.
Well, the work in metal and the work in theater, which is as impermanent as anything could be, and light sculptures and so forth, was that just a side track?
Well, I don't know. Question of permanence. I don't know that whether whether a thing is permanent because you think it's permanent. For instance, the theater sets, I'm surprised that they are as permanent as they are. I mean, for instance, I'm showing some at the Whitney Museum, which are the original, or almost the original pieces, you see. They've been patched up perhaps, but, they do survive. You find, feather robes from Peru, for instance, they survive. I mean, you would never expect them to. You find books, you find little terracotta figures and things which survive all kinds of, vicissitudes, whereas you think of something like stainless steel and so forth as being, everlasting. Maybe they are, but do they really survive? I mean, the survival means other things than just endurance of the material.
The physical.
Do they survive in its beauty? Do they survive in interest? I mean, I don't know. I have an idea that things survive because of a certain quality they acquire. It isn't that they're just stuck still in what they are. They become something else in time. They acquire what I remember Mr. Robert Graves, when I once heard him talking here on the subject of baraka, on the subject of holiness, that which we acquire, this patina of use and age and wonder. There is a kind of a quality which age gives to things. I noticed even on the things we have at the Whitney of Martha Graham, that stage, it looks a little decrepit, but that's rather wonderful,
Through survival.
Survival, yes.
Yes. The mere fact it's still there.
Yeah.
But the idea that sculpture isn't object making seems to be something you're at least implying in the catalog, you talk about spaces versus making space singular.
Well, you know, I make sculptures which are very hard and very, very object in a sense, you know. And yet I'm not really interested in object so much as the ceremony of its usefulness and its place in the world, you know. Its space.
But that's a different sense.
Its space. Definition. Its psychological definition. There are many definitions of spaces, after all, you know. And we live in a space. We exist, and we are defined by our concepts of our limits. And it's the limits that interest me very, very much in whatever I do. For instance, in a garden, it's the wall, it's the limit, you know. Without limits, impossible to do anything. But if you conceive of a limit, and I suppose God has very big limits, you know, he thinks of the whole world as one little peanut, you know, but it's your confidence of having defined your own limits, which is very important to me.
But your sense of the word use in relation to sculpture is clearly different than that of an architect, when an architect discusses use.
Yes.
And you discuss the use of sculpture.
Well, the use of sculpture, of course, has to do with your reaction to it, you see, which is, you might say, aesthetic. You might also say it has to do with the sense of I mean, not in merely physical use, but aesthetic and you know, in a sense, a sculpture which you hardly recognize anymore may have really found its real use, you see, in that it has functioned as a part of your world.
But then time becomes a part of use.
Yes.
As well.
Yes, of course.
I mean, the whole.
Of course. Yes, and I think that if a building, let's say, we're talking of architecture, becomes so you know, familiar and so accepted and beloved, you might say, it is a successful architecture, not because it has made the pages when it was first built. You know what I mean?
Yes, or following some idea of machinery.
Yeah, that's right.
But I've always been curious about the, by and large, artists, with big A now, are discrete and separate beings who do things. Sometimes they're called upon to decorate corporate headquarters or to provide objects in courtyards. But they are essentially not thought of by architects as essential to the creation of what the architects believe they are doing. And they're called in after the fact. You seem to represent somebody who has been involved with architects, well-known, well-recognized, leaders in their profession, in the process of making things. So therefore, it would sound as though it's possible for there to be a collaboration between sculptors and architects.
You know, excepting for the few cases, such as when I worked with Louis Kahn, which I considered to be a real collaboration, you know.
Well, he was also a mystic as well as an architect.
Exactly, he was more than an architect, as I hope to be more than just a sculptor or an artist even, you know. He was an artist and a mystic, and a dialectical architect, I call him, because his process of development was a continuous one. I mean, it was there was no limit to it, you see.
You were saying earlier that he developed buildings in his head faster than he could build them in fact.
Exactly. So he could never stop, and it was very difficult for him to sit down and really realize something, because he had to, you know. In fact, I think he had to run away and just let somebody else do it, and he had to go on.
But how could that be a successful collaboration between the two of you? I mean,
it was a successful collaboration because, first of all, we never built it. And secondly,
it's got to be right. Yes.
Secondly, we were in a constant state of of
getting better.
Getting better, you see.
Never committed. But in general, that's an exception. There is, although my profession talks about it, and recently there's some romance about the decorative arts, there has not been for a long time.
Well, you know, I'm afraid that architects think of sculptors as a sort of a necessary, I won't say an evil, but something added on which could very well be dispensed with. We're probably better off without it, But they are willing to put it in at the last minute if there's any money left, because to placate some requirement of their customer, perhaps, or to they certainly don't put it there to rival their own work,
No,
that would be the last thing they would. And therefore, if you are very successful, you get less and less work from architects because they're a little suspicious of you.
Why did the Detroit project work then, since there was an architectural firm that
There was an architectural firm which had the job, but they needed you see, there was first of all, there was $2 million that Mrs. Dodge had left for a fountain.
Yes.
She wanted something that looked like the Barcelona fountain, I think, And, well, with $2 million, it's very difficult to make a $2 million fountain. How do you spend $2 million on a fountain? And they couldn't figure out who could possibly do it. And so finally, I was in Italy, and they called me up and asked me to please hurry back and do something about it because they were going to lose the $2 million. And without the $2 million, it would be very difficult to get the plaza they hoped to do going. And this was an old time project that Detroit had had in mind for many, many years.
Yes.
All sorts of people had made plans for this particular area, including Frank Lloyd Wright, Saarinen, and others, And so they were determined to use this fountain as a lever to get the thing going.
She had no idea of what kind of fountain.
She had
per
died
se.
by then.
I mean, it was just.
She was 104 years old. She left $2 million.
That was
and
it.
she had died, and that's why we had the $2 million.
I see.
And so there was a fountain selection committee, and I was asked to do something.
But an architect was a part of
yes,
all
but
that.
by the great good fortune, the chairman of the fountain selection committee was also chairman of the architectural firm that had the job to do the plaza, you see. However, when I did the fountain that I came up with, and they accepted it, it didn't fit their plaza. Therefore, they had to get another plaza, and so they asked me to do it. That is how the plaza came to be.
That's a good.
Yes.
But what in the collaborative process was there any, or were they?
Well, not exactly. I mean, that is to say, in fact, I changed it entirely.
Yes.
And so, I mean, you don't say that's collaboration. They were
No.
very, generous in helping with the working drawings and so forth, but there was no collaboration in that sense. No.
They made it possible.
No, actually, I don't really believe there is such a thing as collaboration between architects and
sculptors.
The sculptors are called in as decorators at the end.
Yes.
And but if there is any collaboration, it's the sculptor that does the collaborating. If by that you mean who does all the work and who does all the proposals of what might be done. The architect just sits there and accepts it or doesn't accept it.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, I'm rather suspicious of architects to start with, you see, because I think that's their main role.
Yes. It makes me think of the Bunshaft scenario where your work was transported.
Yes. Well, I suspect that architects bear with you to a point where they've gotten the message, they know how to do it themselves, they don't need you anymore. Then you're out.
Well, architects tend to think of themselves as generalists. They tend to think they're good at thinking about everything.
That's right.
So therefore they can think about sculpture, and they
but
can think about plumbing.
The details of how it might be done, what might be done,
Yes.
is just not within their horizon until they know how to do it. You see.
But architects don't make anything with their own hands.
Well, yeah, that's the difference. I mean, the sculptor is obliged to do it because it's the transmittal of the ideas of what he wants to do is too cumbersome to be transmitted too easily.
But you use machines.
So sometimes I am obliged when I get a big job, let's say a plaza or something like that, to have architects to help me translate it into a form of communication which can be read by a contractor so that it can be done, you see. But that goes outside the realm of sculpture as the sculptor does it, Even so, I'm often running around doing things myself because that's the only way I know how to do things, and to communicate, I find almost easier to just do it rather than communicating by words or otherwise. And but I do admit that I need the help of some trained architectural skill to translate things into the language which contractors understand. I mean, to do a sculpture, I don't need a contractor. I'm the contractor in a sense. I do it myself.
Yes.
Sure.
Although if you needed a machine to do something, you would contract for it.
Well, yes, I would hardly like to call it contracting. I'd say, get me a machine, you see.
And you do it.
Yeah, or,
As work becomes more monumental, and the abstraction and conceptualization of things at a larger and larger scale, it's clear that men have to use machines.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Even on small things, I don't mind using machines.
Right, and the most
because because in the nature of things, if you're coping with something very hard, you've got to have some power there to deal with it. Nowadays, it's with stone. I use diamond tools, for instance. You need some force behind it. And they talk that presently we'll be doing things with laser beams. But that's power. But the power, I would rather control myself rather than have a contractor try to do it for me,
Yes.
It's only on a question of scale that I say you do have to get help.
So you need architects to help realize your ideas.
Yeah, all I need an architect for is to help me to realize my ideas, yes.
so much for collaboration.
Yes.
Why then, if you can directly realize your ideas and use architects or anybody else that happens by, has there been such an extraordinary range of exploration? Why don't you refine a given idea?
Well, actually, I find it most interesting in a period of discovery. Each piece that I do, I don't care whether it's big or small, is for me a discovery of a new way or new approach to do a thing. Because for one thing, I'm quite convinced that it's the moment of discovery, that first time that you do a thing, that the thing has that sense of imminent creation in it. I mean, it has a value which something which is manufactured over again is lacking in. It's that moment of creation which I like to be palpably there, and it's only the first time that it ever is. And I mean, I cannot imagine myself being an architect, for instance, being obliged to go through the whole tedious process of doing doors and so forth over again when I've already done it. I mean, one door
is a door.
make, but I won't make two doors.
Then you reject the idea of casting.
Yes, I do. I mean, I object to it as being merely a reproductive process, which, with the improvement of technology, you can keep on doing it forever. I mean, but it doesn't change. You see, the difference between, let's say, nature, where leaves look similar, but they're not identical. They have their life within them. But these dead objects, which are reproduced, I'm not interested in.
So that each piece is then separate.
Yes, should be something uniquely its own.
But then how can there be any relation to something larger called space? I mean, because the pieces exist in and of themselves.
Yes, but I mean they also exist in space, and everything that you have, I mean, which is unique and original, has contributed something new to the space. You see. Whereas if you want to go into a systems, let's say, this, what you have so much in architecture are systems. You have so many molecules, all identical, doing exactly what you expect them to do. But the combination of them, you might say, is the originality that you introduce. But and I don't mind working with such materials either, for that matter. But it's the discovery that I find so interesting. Don't you find that the same way with architecture?
Well, architecture is very funny at the moment, as I say, being in such a period of transition, because there are words like ambiguity and forgotten all those words. What are all those words? Everybody.
But those are the things that what I'm talking about is that the architects themselves are now looking for that new accident. You see, that those things which they hadn't
juxtaposition,
they hadn't
blah, blah, blah,
already sort of preconceived.
Yes.
They want to find some accidental approach that will, give them a new lease on life. And I think that a lot of the reconsideration that is given now to old buildings and old things is that it gives them a new, new point of view. It's not that it's old, but that it's new.
Some of that is context, and some of that, I mean, you can place a sculpture in a different context, and it obviously has a different meaning.
And an old building has all sorts of quirks about it, which is very interesting suddenly, where you cannot really preconceive.
But the idea of ambiguity, which is new to our profession, seems to be something you've been fooling around with.
Oh, yes. Yes, that's what I'm talking about. The ambiguity is the element, of accident, of the unpredicted, which comes about through the mistake or accident or whatever you want to call it.
I thought art was all about refinement towards some ideal. I thought.
Well, you might find you might have a certain kind of.
I thought one had a vision and one worked towards it all one's life, and finally gets a little bit closer to that ideal.
I'm sure there are artists like that. Maybe most artists are like that, but I don't happen to be one of those. I mean, I retain that idealism, you might say, but I think that if one can add one iota of some new vision, to the world, that's about all you can expect out of me, anyway.
That'll do. Would you say, therefore, that your work is basically about a thing, and that my...
No, I don't. I think that actually all things should or do fall into into its ultimate use. I use the word use very advisedly. I mean, use being not just merely because it cuts something or something else like that, but that it fills a purpose of satisfaction to people in having it around, you see, so that it exists. I mean, whether it's whatever it is, whether it's a figure, a bust, or a shoe, or whatever you have, ultimately, becomes an element of value that you like to have in the relationship of yourself to where you are and how you live. And although I grant that sculptures are generally thought of as objects, I prefer to think that if you think of sculptures as being parts and elements of a much larger whole, let's say a garden, a plaza, the world, the whole works. So that is part of the universe, let's say. Well, then it falls into a much more interesting sort of category of thing, which is a part of the world, which has its own dynamic and will continue to live, and not just because it's lost its value, because it's lost its fashion or something like that.
Well, it's certainly clear, that idea is very clear in the floor pieces, in which you are in and out of something as simple as the floor.
All right, but I mean, if it really functions in a bigger sense, it functions in a smaller sense, and that's the reason I like to work in a bigger sense, in order to let the fallout of things that are permitted in the smaller sense to find its creative originality, you might say.
But why then couldn't one operate on a building? Why couldn't, or does it have to be after the fact?
Well,
in other words, the planet is after the fact. None of us made it, and it's here, and we deal with it. Why couldn't one deal with a building as an object instead of the landscape.
Well, you see, yeah, the building is a arbitrary object, which either graces or clutters the landscape, and I'd rather work in between the buildings, rather than on the buildings or even in the buildings. Although I don't mind, I rather like the idea of being able to do something in the building, but the trouble is the parts in the building are occupied by people, and they won't give it to you.
Yes, they get. But it seems that if the natural landscape could be used and operated on and provide the context for sculpture instead of just a pedestal, because of course in your career art used to just exist on pedestals and in frames, and you've seen all that destroyed.
You have to remember that my whole life, spans the whole gamut from sculptures as objects of value on pedestals, to a point where they've sort of taken off into space, and you wonder where they are. You see them on. I mean, in fact, it's come to a point now almost as if you don't see sculptures excepting as photographs.
Do you think the relation of the public to art has changed any? Or that business of acquiring sculpture and possessing?
Yeah, I personally don't have any much sense of possession, and that's the reason I have a little difficulty in.
But isn't that what fuels the art market?
Yeah, I know. I don't know that I belong in the art market.
Has that changed any? From
Well, I mean, I'm not one to say. I mean, it seems to be thriving, but I'm not a part of it. That's all I can say.
Because there is a certain acquisitiveness, there's a certain built-in status about having the work of an artist.
Yeah, I don't get much particular satisfaction, in having my work acquired by people. I would like to see it in places where people can see them. Yeah.
Can use.
In use. Let's say in a museum or someplace, somehow.
Yes.
But that it goes into somebody's possessions doesn't really mean much to me. I mean, and you might say, well, you can use the money, but other than that, I don't think that it has that much value. I mean, maybe that person will give it to a museum, and ultimately, or someplace where people can see it, and then you say, all right, fine. But I'm rather disagreeable that way, I guess, to most collectors.
I suppose another distinction between architecture and sculpture is that buildings, by and large, or I happen to believe that the only measure of architecture is what's built. And you only get to build a building because somebody has to have something occur or rebuild or what have you. I suppose in the nature of sculpture that there can be created a perfectly bona fide piece of sculpture without any need other than the sculptors. If you needed to make a piece of sculpture,
you needed to make the piece, and without anybody should want to acquire it. It's a very strange experience, you see. And you want to know, well, why do you want it? Where do you want to put it? And so on and so forth, And I suppose if you started asking questions like this about your building, you'd
totally different.
You'd have a good deal of difficulty. And to be an artist architect, like our friend Lucan, for instance, he died broke. I mean, he died broke many times over. I mean, he was a very sad case. I mean, but he did get a few buildings built, towards the end of his life.
Too late.
Yeah, too late. But anyway, he did, and they are a ninth-day wonder, because they got built at all. As a matter of fact, so much of architecture, is a lot of running around and you can tell me more about it than I can, but I mean, it must be terribly difficult to really do good architecture just the way you want it.
Well, it's a resolution of all kinds of opposing forces, which is much different, it seems to me, than the elemental role of a sculptor.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you might say the elemental role of a sculptor, but when a sculptor tries to, go into the areas of space, let's say, other than his own sculpture, that is to say, sculpture in relation to other sculptures, or sculpture in relation to space or to people and so forth, you are entering an area where many people are beginning to be much interested in it, but it is also that area where one would expect compromises as being necessary, in the same sense that you find them in architecture.
Well, you must have
people
found...
have to use it, they have to walk through it.
Yes.
They mustn't bump their head into it, or this and that and the other, you know.
You must have found that in the museum in Israel, where you're dealing with other people's
right,
work.
Exactly. Then you have to, yeah. And I don't know. I mean, people say, well, it's all very well as a garden or maybe a sculpture itself, but it's no good for other sculptors, you know. That I've heard. And maybe.
Do you think it's justified?
Maybe so. Maybe so. You know. And then you might say, well, the building is all right in a building, you know, but is it good for other people?
It
you know?
upstages
say,
what
well,
it's for.
Yeah. You say, well, people,
Yes.
it rains in and you can't use it, and so on and so forth, you know.
Yes.
And so
won't
that
name any
you know,
names.
a real good architect may say, well, what do I care whether it rains or not? I mean, you know, it's a good architecture.
But since you've been able to work both ways, both as yourself as client, if you will, although it's not the right way to say it.
That's the word to use with sculptors. He is the client.
Yes.
Yeah, he is his client. Yeah.
But you've worked both that way, and when you,
yeah,
in a
yeah,
sense, had a
exactly.
client.
Yes, that's right.
Do you think there's any different? Well, obviously there's a difference, but is there any lack of fulfillment when you are working with the resolution of external forces? Whether it be an architect saying, "I fixed my plaza,"
the difference
or
between you know, the architect, since we're talking about architecture and sculptors, the architect seems to work on a piece of paper, you know, and conceives things which are then executed.
Yes.
The sculptor works more directly in the thing. Well, ultimately, it's the experience of the thing actually being built, into which you walk, or on which you walk, or which you see, the very experience of the thing itself that counts, you know. There's no proof of a building until it's built.
I think.
And there's no proof of sculpture either until it is made, and that it has endured, and
Yes.
that people are in contact with it. I mean, the very, you know, tactile value of sculpture, or something you can touch or feel or bump into or have a relationship to in some way or another, is to me that which is important, and not what it actually looks like, you know, only.
Well, I was dazzled to have you say that the Lucan playground would have been built of brick, most likely. I mean, of all the times I've seen the images of it, it never occurred to me.
But you know, at the time when we were defending ourselves, you know, because
Yes.
we were attacked
Constantly.
by these people along Riverside Drive, and others too, who, when we presented our models, drawings, and so forth, were constantly thinking that we were trying to impose a lot of cement upon them, you know. We neither of us had any particular, you know, love for cement. I mean, as a matter of fact, when Lou finally did get some of his large buildings made, they were in India and they were in brick. He loved brick, you know. And so when I say it would probably have been made of brick, is because of Lou's attitude towards brick. And I think that wonderfully soft red brick that
he fell in
is what he really liked.
But obviously, the choices that need to be made between the objects in the Whitney and the actual environment that could exist in Riverside Drive involves so many things that about the use of materials that, in my sense, those are architectural choices.
Yeah. Well, but it's a tactile choice, which I think that maybe an architect, well, depends upon the architect.
But don't you normally work the other way around? Wouldn't, I mean, you're confronted with stone and something is made from the stone, or are you working conceptually and saying, where's a piece of stone? Or
well, no. If I work with stone, I work with stone because
as stone.
As stone, yes. But I can also work with brick. Why not?
True, but the origin of the idea in that case seems to me not to have been any given material, but rather the orchestration of
Excepting that similar things that he did are now in brick.
True.
And so therefore I would
The bulk
say,
of his work is.
Yeah, and I think that the brick is the proper medium.
I mean, the large-scale heroic ideas that you've had, the wonderful cenotaph for Hiroshima and so forth.
It would have been in granite.
Would that have been granite?
Yeah, because I usually think in those terms.
Rocks.
Rocks. Yes.
Rocks. Yes.
What do you think in?
Paper.
Well, that's it. I mean, that's what I mean about architects. Not really, you know.
It's like a child's game. What is this?
Yes,
Stone
exactly.
breaks,
I mean,
paper
but
breaks. What is that?
you're thinking in terms of concepts, you see, which are which are analyzed and reduced and
Yes.
and purified and really to the point of economic possibility. You see.
Well, I have to say that it's true in the bulk of my experience that the material results from other choices. And it seems to me in your case, it's very often the other way around, because it's the material itself
Yes,
that provides
I agree.
the
Yes.
genesis for what you
Yeah,
do.
yeah. But in working with Lu Khan, I cannot say that I had a preconceived notion of the material, you see.
No, I would think it was the opposite,
Yeah.
that you
Now,
had
for
such
instance, in the case of the Atlanta playground, which we just saw,
Yes.
we did think in terms of the earth rather than of concrete. There was no idea of concrete ever there, you see. Those were all metal pieces with earth, either grass or a surfacing of wood bark, which was very successful. Children love it.
What's growing there was there originally?
It was
the trees.
already there, sure.
So that's
we
all,
were not
and-
allowed to move any of them, actually, you know.
Well, there's
So
working with constraints.
that's working with a given space and the given objects already there, the sculptures, which were the trees. And so I was just merely working in between with other sculptures.
It's interesting to me that in the so much of your work is, I mean, a sculptor has to be concerned about light, clearly, because the
Of
work
course.
doesn't exist
Yes,
without it.
yes.
And there was a period where you were actually involved with light in sculpture itself.
Yes. Well, I mean, that was because, I mean, having come to New York from Arizona and having reconciled myself to being in this city and to being a sculptor and so forth, I thought, well, what's wrong with artificial light and artificial situations? And maybe a room, you know, maybe a room within a room, and that sort of thing. And actually, I mean, that kind of thinking, you know, had its later development, for instance, with Kiesler, you know.
Yes, of course.
The
endless space,
room, endless
yes.
spaces, even Peggy Guggenheim's museum was that sort of thing, you know. But if I may say so, I started it.
I won't contradict you. The theater, of course, is the biggest box of all in which you can control
Yes,
light.
that's exactly it. That's probably where it all came from.
And it's interesting in the Whitney
Yeah.
how clearly the stage pieces
Yeah.
register because of the lighting.
Yes. Yes,
And
we worked upon it.
It must be true.
Oh, sure, of course we did. Yes.
By and large, of course, museums have become enamored of theatrical
Yeah.
lighting, and I think.
Well, you see, the museums are changing now
Yes.
into, you might say, almost theatrical experiences. The totality, it must get that way because you cannot, you know, any more than you can define spaces by just putting sculptures here and there. I mean, you have to define spaces more precisely and more thoughtfully. And I think that, you know, just the same as, let's say, a garden, a Japanese garden, let's say. Each stone, each plant is put exactly where it's going to go, and you're not going to be messing around with other stones, you know, putting them in or changing it at your whim.
How do you deal with the garden in time? Because nature doesn't stay in place,
Well, they say in Japan that the rocks are the bones of a garden,
right?
and that the flesh withers and dies, and the trees come and go like weeds.
Not bamboo. It seems to grow like crazy.
Yes,
Takes over everything.
It also comes and goes. It's like the shadow of clouds, you know. It's not there permanently, but it's beautiful to have.
As it comes and goes.
Yes, yes.
So the
it's like,
weeds.
it's like the flesh, which at certain age is beautiful, and then later it changes, but then you get another friend.
You could accept weeds in your garden. Your notion of a garden isn't something that's manicured and fixed, then.
No, it's constantly changing. It's always improving. It's a nature, because nature ages. Rocks age, the trees age. Everything changes and becomes more beautiful or more awful. But I mean, if you have a good garden, it'll continue to get better.
I was interested in the UNESCO garden to see a couple of years ago, and the comparison with the photographs when it was new does seem to me it's a better garden
Of course, it's a better
for having gotten
Yes,
slightly out
yes.
of control.
It takes at least 10 years for a garden to get going.
Suppose the weeds took over.
Even so, I think it would be beautiful. I love weeds myself. I think weeds are superior to artificially developed plants any day. I mean, but then one would have to really plan accordingly, and I would like very much to do a garden with weeds. 4 weeds.
4 weeds.
Yes.
Let them give them their own.
That's right.
Give them
Yeah,
their head.
Yeah. I think it'd be a superior garden myself.
Why not do a sculpture with artificial lighting? I mean, we're
Well, that's what I did. I tried to, you see.
yes, internal.
Yeah, internal, yes.
Why not
yes.
then set up an environment? I guess the Whitney exhibition.
I think that you could have a beautiful garden indoors, But then you do on a stage.
Here we
You're
are,
always doing
yes.
it. You see. Look where we are. I mean,
Right.
you
Couple of
and me.
plants.
I mean, 2 rocks.
Why not pursue that as an idea in your work? Has
Well,
it
I
ever?
will, no doubt. Give me a new idea and I'll
Here
pursue
comes
it like mad.
The nature of stone obviously is different in different parts of the world. So that, and I know that you've been involved in Italy and Japan. Why is it that traditionally sculptors use those same sources? There must be absolutely glorious rocks in Peru.
Oh, absolutely.
And there must be wonderful things.
I'm sure that
the
the
rock.
Machu Picchu. I've never been there, but I'm keeping it in reserve. You might say.
It's coming.
Yes, maybe someday, maybe. But you go
Is that
everywhere
tradition?
in the world. You find gardens. It's amazing,
Yes.
And I'm sure in Peru there are their own gardens.
But is there such a thing as a good rock and a bad rock? Is there some stone?
Yes, there is. And there's the top side, the bottom side, the right and the left-hand side. The formal, the informal, the in between.
Yes.
All that exists.
But
Yes.
why not use the stone that's here? Manhattan's a rock.
Sure. I think Manhattan Rock is
Palisades.
one of the most beautiful.
Have you
Look, go
used
to Central Park, you'll see it.
Yes.
Marvelous. Yeah, I think it'd be a great idea to start carving a rock there.
Mount Rushmore in Central Park. The business about not finishing things and opening up and discovering energy inside, or celebrating accident, if you will, seems to have possessed my profession certainly, and much of creative stuff in general. That seems to have come out of the 20s. Before that time, those ideas were not loose. I mean, there was, as I understand it, there was a preoccupation with stability, and permanence, and change in itself was not regarded as important. Weren't people working at that time to create symbols, if you will, which would survive forever? And aren't we now somehow caught up in the notion of change for its own sake?
I don't know. I mean, I don't work for change for its own sake, I recognize change, and I think change is valuable. We have to change. What we do has to change, but I would rather work in a timeless measure, so that the things that I do will, I hope, continue to get better forever and ever, you see. No matter how much they may be subject to decomposition, so that I'm very pleased if a thing, I see something of mine and it still looks good to me, I say, oh, well, maybe it has something there, and I would feel very unhappy if I thought, oh, well, that's old hat and it's no good anymore.
Is that why you've put away representational sculpture as an idea?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I did a lot.
I mean,
of
direct
heads,
representational
yes.
sculpture.
Well, I did a lot of heads at one time, but even those heads, those that I like, are those that are still alive to me.
Yes.
And I think that my own work shouldn't be. I don't know. I mean, I hate talking about myself all the time. I wish we could talk about you.
Maybe the audience.
Maybe the audience could talk to us.
The audience.
I feel a little bit isolated talking to a
Hello?
dark. I can hardly see with all these bright lights. I would like to see you better, and I would like you to talk to us. Well, there are things that architects can do and things that they can't do, you know. And that there is a great movement right now, apparently, of sculpture sort of walking into a vacuum that they feel opening up. It isn't because the architects have neglected it, because it's not their job in a sense. I mean, they don't know how to deal with it. Isn't that true?
To a large extent. It is true that there's a wholesale feeling of failure in many quarters of architecture, and I think that sculptors therefore can save the day, and maybe architects can. The trick, first of all, is to define what the failure was and how the dimensions of the failure. All those movies which use modern architecture as chilling environments for space fiction or for alienation or for all the rest are an extraordinarily chilling image about what a generation tried very hard, very idealistically to accomplish. I think it's too simple to say that architects are villains, period, because they're people. And they really thought, in a messianic way, they were making a better tomorrow. The failures, therefore, doubly awful.
Well, the failures, I think, are really not the architect's fault so much as the culture that predicated everything upon the economics of its building, you see.
Yes.
And that all the compromises that were made to make sure that it would sell and would resell and so forth limited the architect's possibilities. And I think that there's a great hunger and a desire both on the part of the architect to go into art and the part of the artist to go into a field where maybe the architects have been negligent of.
True. Although I think your comments about the discipline of limits is accurate, and money is a wonderful discipline. The business of architects saying, "Oh, my client did it to me," and all the rest, aren't particularly interesting. Your work certainly exhibits an ability to make something out of anything.
Well, you know, the economics of things also applies to sculpture. I mean, you say that economics are a good, a factor of eliminating unnecessary, if you can do something cheaper, it might be even better. You understand? And I think that probably applies to sculpture too. Why should it be, merely a matter of expense?
Well, I've always assumed that some of the explorations that you represent are questioning that. I mean, why does one have to take a block of marble this big? I've always thought that you could make architecture out of anything because I had sufficient conviction that it existed, that you didn't have to have millions and millions of dollars and lots of bronze to do it.
Yeah.
Whether that's true or not, I'm not sure, but I would like one try.
Certainly there are a lot of sculptors now who think that some means can be found to circumvent the cost of doing things, but then they end up by being cheap. That is, the things themselves are cheap.
Yes.
Because there's a lack of reflection, there's a lack of time, there's a lack of of the possibilities. The reason I like stone is that, first of all, it's a natural medium which is relatively cheap, and the cost of it is its weight. I mean,
Right.
carrying it around. But if you work where the stone is, I mean, you can make it and then maybe you find it worthwhile to move, you see. And also it'll always endure, that is, if it's hard stone anyway. I think that the whole breakthroughs that we are having in architecture and sculpture, certainly in sculpture these days, is partly due to the awareness of new ways of doing things through the pressure of economics.
Yes, there is a great discipline in that.
Yes, there's no question.
Are there other? Yes.
Mr. Noguchi, I enjoyed your discussion about looking into material, looking into stone, finding the light in the stone, something intimate about it. A lot of the sculpture that's done today, the minimalist sculpture, postmodernist sculpture, maybe something like Paul Andre, he'll do things in rocks too, but he orders them more as an architect might lay out a plan. But the materials are sort of secondary. So Andre's sculpture for art, which he ordered 20 rocks to put around a circle, and had very little to do with the material. I think you were talking about architecture and talking about how all these outside constraints, that money is constrained, certain materials varying on one. Very interesting discussion about a year ago by a professor of architecture at Columbia, who said that outside of sculpture, which is permanent, it has its permanent materials that's used for the life that's put in it, there ought to be insurance on building, ruin insurance. And so that building after 5 years or 10 years, it's now a building ruin. And when it destroys, if something else can be created because the constraints that a certain group of society put on it is no longer there, we can get on to something else. Whereas we can't do that now because of the money problem and so forth.
Oh, I think the city is a testament to instant ruins.
But I feel that a lot of sculptors have become seduced that they could do sculptures the way architects do it, you know.
Abstractly.
Abstractly, just conceived as a proposal on paper and then translating it by having it made into metal or something like that, which I find somewhat detestable, you know, because it abdicates the function of the artist, using his hands. It becomes an intellectual thing, and I don't think of sculpture that way.
So you're opposed to the conceptual art of the theory that the act is what counts.
I'm rather opposed to it.
The photographs in the gallery about something that happened elsewhere.
That's right.
The lines on paper.
I question it. Right? It's honesty, as a matter of fact. I mean, you can say that. All right, there is a photograph, and you might say I've done it myself. But I mean, on the other hand, it is not the true sculptor's approach, because it's not the actual creation of something with the material as he knows it.
Well, certainly I don't think our purpose is to make definitions, but there's a clear distinction between the use of materials by a sculptor and that of an architect. Yes.
Earlier, you said that now your sculptures have become photographs. I was kind of curious about what you meant by that.
Oh, I meant exactly what we're now saying, that, I think of sculptures as actual, that the experience of sculpture is the thing itself, the very weight, the textural, tactile object, and your relationship to it, and that merely a photographic record of it does not in any way correspond to the experience of sculpture.
I wanted to know whether your imprisonment during the war had any effect on your attitude about art, your attitude about doing art in America.
Well, I tell you, my own experience in this Japanese camp was a kind of a purifying one. Until then, I was rather socially involved and angry and this and that and the other, and I think that it sort of knocked it out of me. I mean, and also the experience of being in a desert situation in Arizona was a a revelation of this open space, the quiet nights, the you know, I was there 7 months.
I wanted to ask a question to each of you, and that was about architecture and emblems, and sculpture as being an emblem on top of or part of architecture. And I was wondering if either of you could talk about that a little. I was thinking especially about a Noguchi I saw at Yale University, and about Philip Johnson's skyscraper going up in Manhattan with bronze coating.
You mean symbols?
I mean, the part, I guess,
Emblem
the part about
as-
money, and I mean the sculpture is emblem, not sculpture is sculpture, or architecture is function.
Well, many architects are like emblems too. I mean, in many ways, skyscrapers are really emblems. You know, monuments, you might say. I mean, some sculptures are like that. I would prefer that sculptures were not monuments, because it's a matter of scale. It's a you know, I mean, human scale is important to me, and the human experience. That's the reason I'm more interested in gardens than in monumental sculptures.
That's weird, like the distance some of your sculptures have to like the person that's seeing it.
No?
They're like sunken down.
Well, I had nothing to do with that. I mean, that was there.
Well, that's the relation you have to the architect and
Yes,
the site.
yes,
and
all
I
right.
suppose the planning, and like, well, is that an emblem or is that like a sculpture or what? Like, what does that have to do with like an emblem or what is that?
Well, it was maybe conceived. It's conceived of on many different levels. You know, it's conceived of as a you know, as a solution to a problem. I mean, the fact that it's sunken there. Let's say it's a solution also of meaning, emblem, as you say. You know, it has many different levels of consideration of what you do. I mean, and for me to try to put into words the many different things that are considered would be rather futile, because there are other things that has to be also considered. You see, the material, this and that. What is the building made of? What was the meaning of the building to start with? It was a library. You know, all those things go, you know, have part of it, and you cannot just segregate and say what's the emblem. You know, I mean, it's more complex than that, and so I can't answer your question very directly. Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit more about your period when you worked with Brancusi?
Well, Brancusi was a wonderful sculptor that I became fascinated with when I first saw his show here at the Brummer Gallery in '26. And so when I went to Paris in '27, I tried to meet him, and I did meet him, and I worked for him for a while, you know. And I didn't work for him. I mean, I was merely a 22-year-old student, you know, encroaching upon him, and he was kind enough to show me how to use tools, and some tools, and to you know, I benefited from his presence, you know, and he never took an apprentice on, other than, you know, and so he was always he did his own work the way I think a sculptor ought to do it, and I don't have many apprentices or students, you know. I use people, and if they get anything out of me, okay. I mean, they have to steal it themselves. I won't tell them what to do. And I think Brancusi had the same general attitude that he was, you know, that you had to find your own way. You know, he used to say things to me occasionally, which I have retained as sort of aphorisms, you know. But he was, to me, an ideal which I resisted for a long while, but which I more and more accept today as the attitude that I value.
For example?
Yes?
For example, an example of one of the aphorisms.
Oh. Well, he said, never do anything. You know, I was young, and he'd say, well, look, if it's getting hot, and he'd say, look, if you can't stop looking out the window, you better stop, you know. Or he would say, he said, don't do anything as if as if you just have to do it, and it's a chore which you're doing in order to do something else later on. He says, do what you're doing because as if that's the last thing you'll ever be doing, because that's the only thing you'll ever be doing. You'll never do it any better than that, which I think is probably true.
Does that mean that you support the idea of apprenticeship and the
No. I mean, it isn't, I'm not even talking about that. All I'm saying is that the first time you do something, is the best time you'll do that thing. You see, that the second time you do it is less good. And of course, that applies to any reproductive process, that it gets worse and worse.
So much for refinement. Shocked the 19th century. Yes.
What you just said about the difference between doing something because it's a chore and leads to eventually learning at the end of the day, as opposed to doing something as if it was the last time you would do it, and therefore perhaps the dearest effort. Well, that sort of conflicts with what you said just a moment ago about it being the best the first time. But that's.
You gotta allow me that.
I'm curious, and this has something to do with some of the things that I've seen in Mr. Hardy's work very recently. If indeed this is in the middle of the conflict between sculpture and architecture very recently, we go back for a minute. One of the things that has alienated people from modern architecture is that it is so much economics, space management, and indeed is not tactile. You're being told this is a piece of glass that separates you from the outside, makes you inside. This is a column which is here because the construction manager said this is the cheapest way to do it. We have recently efforts to get back to columns you want to attach and walls you want to row up against, and maybe even ceilings you want to bump into. But what you did recently down on 11th Street, that you had that long landmark out about, where you said, this isn't only a brownstone now, this is a brownstone where a couple of SDS people almost, blew the whole block out, and therefore, I don't know if this is really what the intent was in making that wall the way it was, but you were saying that there's an event here or a new building here, a space being filled, and it has to be done in a different way. The blanket effect on that new building in Denver, the roof not really being a roof that you flatten and paint, but that you want to reach out and touch or feel that you're being covered by, is an attempt to, I think, or I hope to get back to substances, elements that are more sculptural in that they are, instead of just barriers or borders, are things. Can you respond to that, or perhaps you see that sculpture has had a hard time in the last couple of years because of these very hard pieces of architecture?
Well, architecture has gotten in the way of a lot of things. I think it's absolutely true that it's Isamu's tactile sense that makes him need to work directly has been lost in architecture. It wasn't always true, after all. We've only been through about a generation of buildings made on paper. If you look at the 19th century, how buildings were made, it was an extraordinary orchestration of skills and very little paperwork involved. By and large, they were built in the field, not in the drafting room. There were images brought to bear with some very skillful types with brushes and pencils and things, but they were only images, and the actual work itself occurred in the field. Now, in this bureaucratic world of paper, we are certainly in a much more abstract world of imagery. And yes, architects, I would hope, are trying to break through that, because the images and the buildings that have resulted are so alien and so hostile to human habitation. And yes, someone like Isamu and his work is of great importance to architecture, and the mere fact that he has refused to stay in place and be an artist with a big A, and even question whether being an artist is even worth doing at all, and all the rest of that challenging, is essential part of what architecture needs to learn how to do. It seems to me that we're fortunate that there are questions being asked. We'd be even more fortunate if the impossibility of collaboration were tried, and there was some exchange made back and forth between different disciplines. It has occurred in other points in time. The very tenacity that makes a sculptor is antithetical to the paper pushing of an architect, but they could benefit from one another, as has been proven, I think, in the beginning of what Isamu's done. This is not a memorial service, after all. We're talking about an ongoing process. It would be too pat and too foolish for me to say that I owe it all to Isamu, but I certainly think it's correct to point out that the ideas that his work has prefigured, shadowed, implied because of being a true exploration, those ideas are now appearing all across the land, and in many fields, not just in architecture itself. Question?
In relation to the lighting that you referred to in theater, and also the pieces you had in the Museum of Modern Art, I think it was last year, the Akari, the lampshades, and stone pieces, I'd like to hear a little more on your thoughts about the relationship that light, as you control it, permeates and pervades the piece of sculpture, the piece itself.
Well, as God said, let there be light. And that's what we see. I mean, we only see that which is reflected light, and the world exists because we are in light. We are in this. We're bathed in this energy of light, and when the light goes out, we are no longer alive. I mean. For a sculpture to be alive requires that it exudes a certain kind of light, and you can actually have it physically, like in the Akari, of course. But I mean, I'm talking about a kind of that the sculpture should sort of invite its being lit and return to you a certain vibration which is visible through light, but which is more than light, which is the resonance of the material itself. I mean, I think that I mean, it's difficult to talk about in light in its most philosophic sense. I mean, I would rather Lou Kahn were here to do it, but he would tell you that yes. Light is what a building is about. I mean, it is what, and in fact, his whole latter work had to do with these great, enormous circles of openings. He detested windows, but he loved light. It was how to bring light into the building and into people's lives. And I mean, sculptures are merely certain reflections of light. That's how I feel. And if you can do it artificially, okay.
What potential do you see for other kinds of artists to collaborate with architects? This is a question for both of you. Some artists, such as painters and graphic designers, have specific skills that apply. And Mr. Hardy, could you ever see collaborating with, for example, a choreographer to plan a building?
Good person to ask.
It's a wonderful question. Could you imagine collaboration with a choreographer in the planning of a building? In the stupid sense, yes, if the choreographer were a client for whom you were doing a place that he was going to do choreography. But in a more interesting sense, could you, it's something that you make me think of we haven't discussed, but how an architect is put to work is really quite different, I suspect, on the whole, from a sculptor, in the sense that someone comes to you, or a group, or whatever, and they have this thing they're trying to do, and they tell you about it. Until they tell you about it, there isn't any making of architecture. There's just no way. You can't make a building without a client. You cannot, it's impossible. Even if you make it for yourself, your house, say, you then accept two roles. So as people come to you and tell you what they need or want, they express themselves usually verbally, usually very badly. And I've always wondered, since you translate the verbal language into a visual one to make architecture, why couldn't people express themselves in other ways? It seems to me a choreographer could, a poet could, etc., express the need, the requirements, not in the hardware sense, but the larger requirements that are why the building is to be. It's never happened, but I don't see why it wouldn't be possible. The further thought that a choreographer could be a help in the planning of the movement of the people in the building, I think is untrue in my experience, because most choreographers, strangely enough, can only think in 3 dimensions when they are the center of the stage. They don't think in abstract at all. I don't know what Isamu's experience has been with Martha Graham in her work, but in my own, the choreographic sense, which is so powerful in the motion and the movement of people in space, occurs within that box of the stage, and usually because the person themselves has to be doing it directly. And the thought that that extraordinary talent could be useful in the more abstract planning of how people could get up and down and around in this building and where the elevators and stairs would go, I would doubt. But it's always worth a try. Question?
So you have for many, many years been personally close to Buckminster Fuller. It has been a friendship that has continued for decades. I'm curious to know what it is that philosophically or personally drew you to him and continues to keep both of you very strong and mutual friends.
Well, I mean, you might say it's a view of the world, and I've been very fortunate in having a number of such teachers, such people who taught me through our conversation, and as I hope that we are, in a sense, conversing. You know, he was older than I, and he still is. And he has always, you know, been able to tell me things more than I could tell him. I hope I may have had some influence on him too. You see, I find that he's an awful lot in the Orient. He's hardly visible around here anymore. Anyway, he took flight, you know, a little later than I did. But we are both flying around the world, he more than I. But maybe I was a little ahead of him. But he meant, and always has meant a lot to me, as the most hopeful person I know about the world. You know, he looks upon the world as a whole, the whole universe, as a matter of fact, and envisions the Earth as the spaceship Earth upon which we float, and that this whole sort of universal vision I subscribe to, and I probably get a lot of my thinking from him, and how you know, everything relates to each other. He calls it synergy. The things together, certain things together in combination are more different and more than individual pieces. And that sculptures too, I mean, have a synergetic relationship in that as a totality they form a culture, and within it people can function, you see. And I might point out that I worked a lot with dancers. About your previous question, the dancer, you become the dancer, it isn't what they tell you, but you yourself are the dancer. So if you do an architecture with dancers, you are the dancer. And you imagine the total space, and that the space becomes more because of your intercession than without it, you see. You are creating space, more space than there was there. The building takes so many square feet, but you're creating many more square feet than that because of you are the dancer within it, you see.
From the activity itself.
Yeah, exactly. And therefore, you're asking me about Bucky. With Bucky, I become a fly. I'm all over the place, you see. I'm not really earthbound. I'm skyborn. And it is in that sense, that he represented and does represent for many people a kind of the hope of the universe or of America or what have you, something more than what we started out to be. It all adds up to some new vision. Maybe he's right that we can be saved. Who knows?
Question.
In your work with the Japanese architect, Mr. Tange, would you not call that a collaboration? And since that was in connection with the School of Flower Arrangement, wasn't there a three-way collaboration?
No. Actually, I get along very well with Mr. Tange. He leaves me strictly alone. He seems to appreciate what I do without trying to impose his way, you see. It isn't that he does not question me sometimes, but his questions are discreet and I appreciate them. He doesn't have to tell me too much if I need to change something. In the case of the flower arranging school, it was the misfortune of you might say, a certain mismatch between the function of flower arranging, the function of a building, the cold geometry of glass and concrete, and how to humanize it a bit, which was beyond his capacity. So he turned it over to me, and I don't know that I succeeded entirely either, for the simple reason that maybe actually, I'm not at all that much sympathetic to the idea of flower arranging as a public display, I think of flowers, I prefer flowers as modest evidences of nature and not, monuments. So you see, it's not that, but I tried to create a landscape, you might say, which is not quite correctly treated that way, and so I'm a little critical about it. I would prefer that they found some new sort of ritual use of it, which I don't think exists. In fact, I think the ritual use of art doesn't exist properly. Especially when it comes to big works of art, And I don't know, maybe it exists in this country, but it certainly doesn't in Japan, and I don't see why in the world they keep on making these great big paintings and whatnot when there's no place to put them. There's got to be a certain harmony and relationship. And it used to be in the Japanese house, there was a place called the Tokonoma, which was a place where you put your flower arrangement and you put your painting, which changed with the seasons. It was modest in scale, just right. It was a perfect solution. As far as I was concerned, and I'm rather old-fashioned.
Question.
think that brings up a good question about the industrial designer. And I wonder, you talk about the interdisciplinary like collaboration, and I wonder what role you see the designer of a toaster or an oven or a can opener plays within the aesthetic experience of modern man. What about the housewife? How is she experience sculpture? She's not coming to see Noguchi. She's fooling around with her stove. And how do
I would, since I presume you're asking me. I would prefer that people made their own can openers. I mean, the industrial designer, I think, is a menace. I mean, because
Should we make our own can?
yeah. Well, do without it.
Question.
I was wondering about, you began the slides with a slide of a drawing that we've done. I was wondering what how drawing helps you in developing your concepts.
Well, it's a very inadequate, I hardly make drawings nowadays. I mean, it's just a presentation of an idea, and so far as the sculpture is concerned, if you can really visualize in a drawing, why make sculpture? I mean, to me, a sculpture is that which is beyond description, either of words or of pencil. I mean, and it should develop as you go along. That's how I feel about it. But
I have a second question also. What is your, since you're talking here with an architect and a lot of your work is architectonic in scale at least, what is your advice for future architects in terms of the movement of different movements in architecture? Where would you like to see it go?
Well, I tell you, personally, I wish that architects paid more attention to the spaces around them. I mean, that is to say, in relation to space, maybe there isn't any space, and maybe everything is inside the building. And there you have the misfortune of the economic situation. But even so, I think that the space relationships could be much enhanced beyond what they are, there are architects who are working in those fields, including you, I saw a thing of his in Minneapolis where there seemed to be a huge boulder inside a building, which turned out to be a theater, you see. There was an object inside the theater, and you were walking around it more or less, wandering around until you found your way inside this thing. I mean, I found it very interesting. And, there you find a sculpture concept of this roundish boulder, and there's a square building. And that kind of space where the people seem to have this esplanade or walking around this thing, I found very interesting.
Question.
You talked about liking buildings and liking working with materials. I wondered, have you ever designed and built and lived in a house? In other words, lived in a house that you both designed and built with your own hands?
No, I've never done architecture. I have an old house in Japan which is very, very, pleasant to live in. But it's an old traditional house. I've never built a house myself.
So you talked about liking function.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe I should try, but I mean, I just haven't had time, and I haven't done it.
Question.
Do you have a favorite piece of your own sculpture, favorite architectural piece, and you had to pick one out in New York City?
Actually, I like the Chase Manhattan Bank Garden, if you ask me that. Because a lot of people can look at it from above, they can look at it from below.
And
it changes with the seasons a bit.
That's the most wondrous to me.
Yeah, I
It
like
accepts
it.
the seasons as a part of its
exactly, yeah.
vocabulary. Most fountains are pretty dreary things, and it's more than a fountain. It's more than it's a seasonal garden. I think we'll take one more question.
I haven't seen it and I don't know it.
What about the concerns in that stuff? Like, do you ever try to channel your concerns into that sort of like positive, maybe like practical use? Either of it, like especially. Do you want to get your stuff into like solar energy or something like that? Do you deal with like problems that kind of thing?
Oh, we have to. We all collectively must become more responsive and aware of what's around us. I mean, in the big sense, we won't survive otherwise. But there's a lot of hardware between us and doing that. We just have to get to work about it. I hope that despite the artificiality of this conversation, that you are all collectively more curious about Isamu, and will have an opportunity to see his new work and to continue to share the fun of talking with him. Thank you.